involved in something that was maybe like a wish of mine that something like this might exist maybe a decade ago, but it didn't anywhere. And so to be able to see it happening and people coming and all of you sort of sharing in this, what for me has been a really long spiritual journey, is a pretty amazing thing for me. And I'm really happy to see faces here and that other people would come to something that seemed like it really spoke to me and called to me and was something I felt, at least for me, was needed. And then I was drawn to building, and that there are all these great people that have helped build it and make it into something real is pretty amazing. I had a lot of years where I was away from church and not going anywhere and kind of pretty angry at God, mostly because of a lot of places where I found people talking about God in church settings in a way that did not feel like love or feel like kindness or feel like caring and stewardship and all those things that I felt like I had learned at a very young age were essential to who God was in my life and who God was in the people I really loved and that really represented that for me. Being my parents and my grandparents and some really strong foundation in that, but that I found a lot of places where I was in a church and not necessarily seeing those things. I mean, we're all human, and I had a kind of an intolerance for human nature in people and in the tendency for, you know, when we get grasped onto something like God, that we can identify power and ownership and sort of there becomes a sort of a club membership type thing about it. And in that, I didn't find a lot of love. And so for me, it was a long time of being angry at God because of the things that I was seeing in humans. And not realizing that it's just, even though it seems very simple, you know, and that's why the topic I put is God of love. And I'll talk a little bit more about the scripture that Andrew read and how I see that reflected. But that it just seems like a very kind of wistful, you know, easy thing to say, oh, God's love, or God's about love, or just love one another. And it sounds cheesy, and it doesn't sound like, you know, there aren't really rules of how to get there. How do you just love? But that sometimes when we get stuck in some of the theology of things, some of the doctrines and the laws and the rules that were there to kind of get us started, we get stuck in the rules and the laws and maybe forget about the essential core of why they were there, that they were kind of guideposts to help us love more and understand love, see love in others and see the need for love in life, which again comes back to many of my experiences of church until I kind of found St. Paul's. Chris and I stumbled upon this place, and it really became not just a home and a house with a literal roof, but really a spiritual roof where we could share our life and share our faith together, and in a place that was open enough to have conversation about things that were important to me and things that I valued, and not having to have one person be right and one person be wrong, or that only certain people are allowed in the club, or when we think of the club in terms of heaven, only certain people are allowed in heaven. For me, it was an important conversation to have, even with people that disagree. And for me, at least, this church and the Episcopal Church was a home where I found it. I don't think it's the only home, and I don't think it's the only way, but I think that there's a lot of lacking of that in a lot of Christianity, unfortunately, today. The same way that there's a lacking of a lot of that in just systems in general. So we talk about politics, we talk about religion, those things are systems. And once we get systematic about things to the point that it becomes more about I'm right and you're wrong, there's no room for love. It's just about ideas. And ideas really don't always end us up at a place of love. And this scripture, this passage for me, talks a lot about that because I think of the time that Jesus was in. This whole story is kind of three different parts to it. You know, it's the part of Jesus asking his followers, his disciples, I say sometimes you could call it his campaign team, you know, who do you think I am? What do you think of me? Kind of what would you call me? And some said, you know, like a teacher, a prophet, somebody who's come to sort of get us further on the journey. And then Peter says, the Messiah. I think you are the leader, essentially. You are the king that we've been waiting for. And And first he tells them to tell nobody about that. And that in itself is kind of the opposite of everything that we do in this world, is about gaining roles and about having things. And when we think of leadership and power and authority and those things that sometimes we relate to when we think of God, you know, we kind of see power in the structures in the world that we live in. So for somebody to say, essentially, I'm connected to the largest power of all time that has ever existed, but by the way, let's not talk about it, is really kind of like turning upside down everything we've ever learned, at least in the Western world, in the culture of the United States, of where it's really about getting the next thing and getting the next role and getting the next title, and that we identify ourselves with how much power we have a lot of times, even without meaning to. So just that in itself was one, his unit, his team, his campaign team, his disciples, his students, all coming to understand who he really was, and him telling them not to tell anyone, and sort of the inherent humility in that. And the secondary piece to that being that the way that he then defined what kind of leader he was flipped everything upside down. Because in that time, the Jewish people, the leader they were looking for a king like the equivalent of a president or of a monarch, you know, that we see now. They were looking for somebody who was going to rise up and was going to take their power back for them. And that's what they wanted. That's what they thought the Messiah was there to do. So there's so much laden in these few words that he says, because he's talking about the fact that I am who you say I am, but what that means is that I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and if you decide to pick up your cross and come with me and carry this with me and express this expression of love with me in this kind of a way, and this is what authority looks like in God's plan. Not that I'm going to be president, not that I'm going to be king, and not that we're going to take over the whole world, but that to prove to people something that's beyond the limits of anything we can understand about what power means, because that's what they were looking for. They were looking for the traditional power. He said, I'm going to have to die. And to them, that was like, that's the craziest thing we've ever heard. You're here to save us. You're here to fix everything. You're here to, you know, essentially take up the sword and show everybody that you are stronger and more powerful than anybody who's ever come before. How on earth can you show them all that? By dying. That's the opposite. That's the weakest thing. That's the, you know, that's the least thing. And on top of it, by the way, if you want to join my team, my campaign team, my party, probably that's going to happen to you too. So I don't know if we had like a presidential candidate or a king maybe of past, and they told their followers that it would be very easy to follow them, or if it made any sense, would make any sense. I would think it makes just as little sense then as it does now, even though, you know, sitting in this room, sitting in a Christian, there's a lot of Christianity in this nation, but a lot of us don't live our life from the place of power being letting go of power, or power and strength being letting go of the whole system, letting the system do whatever the system's going to do, which means that really the system destroys authentic power, authentic authority, the thing that doesn't need it to survive. Because the thing about needing the next best thing or the next good thing, whether it's an item or a raise or a new job or a new car, is that the system thrives on that. It builds itself up on power and on the need for power. So to say that you don't need that is a very dangerous thing, which is the very reason why he knew he was going to be killed for it. And he's asking these people to follow him on that way. So in a very short period of time, he's not only told them, yes, I'm the guy you've been looking for, I'm the king, I am the Messiah, but by the way, I'm going to die real soon, and if you come with me, so are you. That's a lot to take in. And I don't think that necessarily they understood what most of that meant at the time. I think they were just kind of blown away.